Okay, so how do we start this? We covered 3 editions of Garner's Modern American Usage Guide. Yeah, can you see that? Yeah. We mainly compared the prefaces, the list of essay entries, and the table of contents for the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd edition. We didn't really touch on the preface for the 1st edition that much, mainly because we had gone over it in class a lot, but... Yeah, there was actually only one major point that I wanted to touch on from the 1st edition preface that we didn't have a chance to go over in class, and I think it reflects something of Garner's rhetoric in all 3 editions. This is a specifically American book, both in its scope and its point of view. During the mid-20th century, the English language's center of gravity shifted from England to the United States. And with that shift comes a certain responsibility on the part of those who speak and write American English. So here's Brian Garner basically saying the torch has been passed down to the American people to uphold the state of our language, kind of prevent it from decaying. And I've been thinking a lot about why that might be, why he thinks that shift occurs, and this is definitely open to discussion in class. It's a bit of a reference to Britain's loss of its imperial power throughout the world.
It's lost, taking a step back.
Yeah, it's taking a step back, it's losing status, whereas the United States, ever since the end of World War II, ever since the 1950s, has been growing as an industrial power throughout the world, and so it has a greater reputation to uphold, and it has more influence, arguably, on standard English and how it is interpreted.
Actually, it's the first sentence. People have asked whether enough has really changed in English usage since 1998 to justify a new edition. And I think that sentence in itself really solidifies his attitude on his authority. He's saying nothing has really changed. I've just added some more stuff. He says the answer is that changing usage isn't really the primary basis for a new edition of a usage guide. It's really a question of having had 5 more years of research. So basically just put it in a book when we compared the table of contents.
Like double the content of the 1st edition.
Oh, wherever the table
There
of
have
contents
been omissions, he just hasn't really advertised them. He doesn't advertise revisions either, so his thinking on the old matters hasn't really changed. There was one change that we found really significant that Hannah can tell you a lot more about.
Okay, in the list of essay entries, under adverbs, we found that in the 2nd edition it was there, adjectives or adverbs after linking verbs. And when you examine the actual entry about it, the section says, English contains a number of linking verbs, or copulas, apart from to be, appear, seem, become, look, smell, taste. These adverbs connect a descriptive word with the subject. Hence, the descriptive word following the linking verb describes the subject and not the verb. We say, he turned professional, not he turned professionally. Writers frequently fall into error when they use linking verbs. One must analyze the sentence rather than memorize a list of common linking verbs, much as this may help. Often, an unexpected verb of this kind appears. No other rule sweeps so broadly. The writer intends not to describe the manner of sweeping, but to say the rule is broad.
Except, this rule is omitted in the 3rd edition, and I think just glancing at this entry I can see why. Because he makes this argument that, okay, so no other rule sweeps so broadly. He argues that broadly is meant to modify rule, but in a sense, I would actually argue that broadly is meant to modify the verb. It sweeps broadly. So
that's how I interpret it as well.
Exactly. This kind of comes across as maybe a little bit of an antiquated way of looking at it, and maybe to Garner, he also rethought it for the 3rd edition and omitted it, but didn't make much of a fuss.
No.
He does not advertise his own omissions. He only advertises his more extended research.
Back to the preface of the second edition. In the third paragraph, some people have asked whether it's realistic to expect that, as language questions arise, people will really look up entries in a book of this kind. The answer is that many people do. But the better answer is that a usage guide of this kind isn't just or even primarily for consultation as questions or doubts arise. It is intended for browsing a little at a time and for serious reading. Pick it up during the summer, read it cover to cover, no big deal. So the preface in the third edition, he has an interesting way of allowing us to consult him, or knows more of a invitation to dispute.
Yeah, basically.
Or argue or validate our own points that may be different from his.
Anyway, I've got this on my phone, and I'm sure that Haname is going to edit in this photograph later. What Garner states is that readers will inevitably find rankings with which they disagree. If you find yourself in serious disagreement, and if you believe that the mark of a genuine scholar is never to leave an answerable question unanswered, research the point and send me your argument, urging a change, and support it as best as you can with evidence. You can reach me directly at bgarner@lawprose.org. I'm always grateful for thoughtful, well-considered suggestions. There are a couple of things that this immediately suggests to me. First of all, that Garner is feeling pressure from the modern world. He published his third edition in 2009, 6 years after his second edition. And by this point in time, I feel like we were beginning to see more of a rise in internet journalism and acceptance of blogging and blogging platforms, and an acceptance of the idea that people should be able to comment on not just news stories, but
public knowledge.
Yeah, but public knowledge. This is his kind of way of yielding to that.
Yeah, inserting himself into that culture.
So that he can keep his usage guide relevant in some way. We also both found it kind of interesting that he did not provide an email address for a committee or a council or anything like that. It had to be his direct personal email. So basically, if you're going to challenge one of my rules, you are coming up against me, Brian Garner. So
I'm sorry, try to hold in the laugh. You're coming up against me, girl. Brian Garner.
Mm-hmm.
Word. And I'll insert a picture of his face.
Yes! You should do that! That would make me so happy! Oh my god.
In his list of essay entries, back to his list of essay entries, under Sound of Prose, there's a section called Undue Alliteration or Rhyme, and that really intrigued me because I like alliteration. I think it provides a nice dimension, I guess.
An extra dimension to prose.
Not only prose, but poetry and prose together, you know, they both, I use them interchangeably in my own writing, so.
We were both, after we noticed that this was an entry in this edition, we both had this long discussion about how we both really, yes, we had to look it up, and we both had this really long discussion about how we both really value the intersection of prose and poetry and how we think they can work together. So we had strong opinions.
I'm just going to read this section. I.A. Richards, in a classic book, wrote, "But in most prose, and more than we ordinarily suppose, the opening words have to wait for those that follow to settle what they shall mean." Which I think, in my personal opinion, is a lovely sentence that was very well formatted. But he continues, "This type of wordplay, assuming that it is wordplay, should be undertaken cautiously because it declares that the writer is being wry or coy."
I was really intrigued that he thought that alliteration could only be wry or coy, because to me, whenever I see alliteration, either in poetry or in prose, sure, sometimes it's just clever for the sake of being clever, and sometimes that's irritating, especially if the author isn't that intelligent in other dimensions. But I feel like alliteration can be used for more purposes than just that. It can also be used, for example, to emphasize something.
My opinion goes along the lines of, I agree with you, for the most part. The alliteration can be really attractive in writing. there's some times where it's not effective at all, and you have really clunky sentences because of it. But that doesn't make it wrong to use.
Yes.
What this book is for, the usage guide, is suggesting things that you shouldn't ever do, really. It's not really a suggestion box
I guess
for
not.
writing.
I mean,
he has an authority on what we should be doing in writing, and that is obviously not with undue alliteration.
the idea to me of anybody having an aesthetic authority is very strange.
What I would also like to see is more clarity on what he thinks undue alliteration is. He's not claiming
we don't really
all.
get a discussion of that.
What examples he gives us is other phrases susceptible to this problem include instead of a steady, which I personally have never heard before.
Nope.
Tempted to attempt. I've heard that a couple of times.
Maybe.
Net debt schedule, and need not know. The last one is really kind of...
That's kind of a classic phrase, isn't it?
Don't we use that pretty often? Often enough where it would be understandable in its use? Like,
Well,
I'm not-
understandable, but...
But it's not undue.
Right. I mean, you'd have to... There's a case to be made that it's not undue in every instance that it's used. And also, one of the examples that he includes of alliteration in this section is not even alliteration.
That makes some sense, since a child who his mouth runs is going to have a hard time winning friends. Okay, that I don't agree with.
Yeah,
at
I
all.
wouldn't agree with that either.
That's an actual sentence right there.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that Garner seems really concerned about is the role of journalism in language decay. For example, in his very first preface, he states the following: "A great deal of mediocre writing appears in print nowadays, and both written and oral assaults on the language do seem to come at high velocities. The speed comes from mass communication. Turn on the TV and listen to commentators on football, tennis, or golf, and you'll be treated to the heights of inarticulacy. Then imagine all the millions of viewers whose linguistic perceptions are affected by this blah." So yes, blame the newscasters, blame the journalists, blame the commentators for this verbal assault on standards of English. But it isn't until the third edition that he devotes a specific section of his usage guide to the errors of journalists. And in the third edition, actually, he has the sections peculiar usage of, peculiar grammar of, peculiar style of, guidance for journalists, and further reading. And what's most interesting to me about this is that it took him so long to include this, because obviously he does place a lot of blame on journalists and newscasters and the like for degrading the language in a lot of ways. So I got to wondering, what could have prompted him in 2009 to say, gosh dang it, I really need to include a section on those pesky journalists and their headlinees. And I feel like this is kind of closely tied to the fact that it is also in the 2009 edition that he includes his email address for the first time. As I touched on briefly earlier, internet journalism was becoming more accepted, and different forms of journalism were becoming more accepted. People read more news, people watch more news, people consume more news and commentary right now in the age of the internet than they ever did before. So, with all of that comes increased exposure to what Garner doubtlessly concerns extremely substandard English, thus the need to include this whole section on headlinees, and perhaps in further editions we'll see an expansion on this.
A good question to open up to the class would be whether you think that public speakers, as news anchors or public blogs, newspaper, I guess, on the internet, people read that still, whether they should be the people that uphold the rules, or we can have artistic license and
Have one leeway.
say whatever we want.
What it means to be prescriptive, and how, you know, we kind of have to be just as accepting of that as of other impulses to be creative with language, because prescriptivism is just another kind of creativity. I don't know.
This is true. Oh, well, that's actually a good point.
Oh, cool.
She married a Hoosier. I don't know who she's married to. So.
Neither do I. I don't care.
Anyway.
So, in conclusion...
Oh my gosh, don't say that! We can say it together, really cheesy like.
Oh, fuck. We are not doing...
In conclusion, Michael Adams.
What can I say?
Oh my god. The points that we've gone over.
And that's our presentation.
Yeah, the end. That should actually be the end.
That's just... No.
No?
Yes.